The United States can continue asserting these are international waters, but when our icebreakers are patrolling them, when our ports are servicing the vessels, when our regulations are safeguarding the Arctic, sovereignty isn't what you declare on documents, it's what you can actually enforce. That was Mark Carney addressing reporters after announcing $7 billion for Arctic icebreakers. No diplomatic language, no cautious qualifications, just a straightforward message to Washington. The era of treating Canadian Arctic waters like an American thoroughfare has ended. For 7 decades, the United States dispatched ships through the Northwest Passage without requesting authorization. Submarines emerged at the North Pole in Canadian territory and designated it international waters. Icebreakers flew American flags through Canadian Arctic channels and informed Ottawa there was nothing they could do about it. Washington was correct. Canada asserted sovereignty but couldn't enforce it. No infrastructure, no military presence, no mechanism to actually regulate who used the passage. Consequently, the United States, Russia, and China all regarded Canadian Arctic claims as courteous fiction. Then, Donald Trump threatened to annex Canada economically. He labeled it the 51st state. He imposed tariffs. He pressured Mark Carney into power specifically to resist American influence. And Carney looked north at a $900 billion trade corridor that was melting open, a shipping route that eliminates 7,000 kilometers off the journey between Asia and Europe. Arctic waters that Russia and China are desperately attempting to access. Canadian territory that Washington kept maintaining belongs to the world. Trump believed economic threats would compel Canada to accept American terms on everything. Instead, he provided Canada the motivation to finally accomplish what it should have done decades ago: build the physical presence to enforce what it already possesses. Tonight, we're revealing how Canada is transforming American pressure into Arctic capability, how a climate crisis became a strategic advantage, and how the Northwest Passage just became the location where Canada finally tells the United States, our territory, our rules, and there's nothing you can do to prevent us anymore. But before we explore this development, if you value comprehensive analysis of this caliber, hit that like button and subscribe to remain informed on the developments that genuinely matter. Let's begin with geography. The Northwest Passage isn't a single route, it's a series of waterways threading through Canada's Arctic archipelago, connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. For centuries, it was blocked by ice. Explorers perished attempting to find it. Ships got trapped and crushed. It was theoretically valuable, but practically worthless. Climate change eliminated that obstacle. Arctic ice is vanishing at an accelerating pace. The passage that was frozen solid 10 months annually is now navigable for increasingly extended periods. By 2035, experts predict it could be ice-free most summers. By mid-century, potentially year-round with icebreaker assistance. The economic scale. The economic implications are staggering. A container ship traveling from Shanghai to New York through the Northwest Passage saves over 6,000 kilometers compared to the Panama Canal route. That translates to days of travel time, millions in fuel expenditure, faster delivery for time-sensitive cargo. Current projections estimate that by 2050, the Northwest Passage could accommodate between 2 to 5% of global shipping traffic. That doesn't sound massive until you realize global maritime trade is worth roughly $20 trillion annually. 2% of that is $400 billion. 5% is $1 trillion. But here's what makes it genuinely valuable. It's not merely about transporting consumer goods. The Canadian Arctic contains massive deposits of critical minerals, rare earth elements, nickel, copper, lithium, zinc, gold, resources essential for everything from electric vehicles to defense systems to renewable energy technology. For decades, these deposits were economically unviable because transporting them to market was impossibly expensive. No roads, no rail, no ports. The sole option was flying materials out, which made mining operations prohibitively costly, except for the highest value materials like diamonds and gold. The Northwest Passage transforms that equation completely. Construct Arctic ports, provide icebreaker support, establish shipping infrastructure, and suddenly those mineral deposits become economically viable. Canada becomes a critical mineral superpower, and whoever controls access to the passage controls the gateway to those resources.
That's the $900 billion figure. Not just shipping fees, but the total economic value of Arctic trade, resource extraction, and strategic positioning over the next 3 decades. The legal stalemate. Canada has asserted sovereignty over the Northwest Passage since 1946. The legal argument is straightforward. These are Canadian internal waters. The passage runs through Canadian territory. Ships crossing it should require Canadian authorization, just like vessels sailing up the St. Lawrence River or through the Great Lakes. The United States never accepted this assertion. Washington's position has remained consistent for decades. The Northwest Passage is an international strait under international maritime law. That means any vessel has the right of transit passage. Canada can regulate environmental standards and safety requirements, but it cannot deny access. This wasn't merely a theoretical dispute. In 1969, an American oil tanker called the Manhattan sailed through the passage without requesting Canadian authorization. Canada was furious but powerless. They dispatched icebreakers to escort the ship, attempting to assert some level of authority, but the message was clear. The United States would transit the passage whenever it desired. The same occurred in 1985 with the icebreaker Polar Sea. American vessel, no authorization requested, straight through Canadian Arctic waters. When Canada protested, Washington doubled down. These are international waters. We don't need authorization, and we're not going to request it. In 1988, both nations signed the Arctic Cooperation Agreement, basically an agreement to disagree. The United States pledged to notify Canada before American icebreakers transited the passage. Canada gained symbolic recognition, but neither side altered its legal position. The enforcement problem. The challenge for Canada was enforcement. Asserting sovereignty is one thing. Actually controlling the territory is another. For decades, Canada simply didn't possess the infrastructure or military presence to substantiate its claims. The Canadian military had minimal Arctic capabilities. One exercise annually, a handful of rangers conducting patrols, Coast Guard ships that could only operate during the brief summer months, no deep water ports, no permanent bases, no ability to actually monitor who was using the passage, much less stop them. So the United States kept treating it as international waters. Russia built up massive Arctic infrastructure in a fleet of 50 icebreakers. China started calling itself a near-Arctic state and sending research vessels through the region. And Canada could only watch and issue diplomatic protests that everyone ignored. When Trump started threatening Canadian trade in 2025, something fundamental shifted in Ottawa's strategic thinking. For years, Canadian Arctic policy had been aspirational. Politicians discussed sovereignty and made promises about infrastructure, but the investments never materialized. The political will wasn't there. Trump changed the calculation overnight. Suddenly, Canada needed alternatives to American markets. Suddenly, diversifying trade routes wasn't just an appealing concept, but an existential necessity. Suddenly, the Arctic went from a theoretical priority to an urgent strategic imperative. Mark Carney saw the opening. His first federal budget, released in November 2025, included $1 billion over 4 years for Arctic infrastructure. Not for studies, not for planning, for actual construction of ports, roads, icebreakers, and military facilities. The Port of Churchill Plus project.
The centerpiece was the Port of Churchill Plus project. Churchill is Canada's only Arctic region deep-water port. It's connected by rail to the rest of Canada. It sits on Hudson Bay, which connects to the Arctic Ocean in Atlantic shipping routes. For decades, it had been chronically underfunded, handling minimal traffic, barely economically viable. Carney's budget committed $180 million over 5 years just for Churchill, upgrading port facilities, modernizing the railroad, building ice-breaking capacity to extend the shipping season from 4 months to potentially year-round operations, creating infrastructure for exporting grain, potash, liquefied natural gas, and critical minerals. But Churchill was just the beginning. Comprehensive Arctic investment. The broader Arctic Infrastructure Fund targeted airports in the far north, all-weather roads connecting isolated communities and mining sites, expanded Coast Guard presence, new radar and surveillance systems, military facilities supporting year-round operations instead of just summer exercises. Critically, $7 billion for 2 new heavy icebreakers. Not just any icebreakers, polar-class vessels capable of breaking through 3 meters of ice, operating year-round at temperatures down to -50 degrees Celsius. Ships that could establish a permanent Canadian presence in Arctic waters, regardless of conditions. The timeline is aggressive. First icebreaker delivery by 2030, second by 2032. Churchill port upgrades beginning immediately. Critical minerals export infrastructure operational within 5 years. This isn't a long-term vision. This is happening now. Here's what Trump didn't understand. Physical presence creates legal facts. For decades, the United States could treat the Northwest Passage as international waters because Canada couldn't effectively control it. No ports meant no way to service ships. No icebreakers meant no way to escort or monitor traffic. No military presence meant no way to enforce regulations. But that's changing rapidly. Once Canada has icebreakers patrolling year-round, they can require ships to check in, accept Canadian pilots, follow environmental regulations, and pay fees for navigation services. Once there are functioning ports offering refueling and repairs, ships have reasons to comply with Canadian authority rather than risk being denied services. The United States can keep insisting the passage is international waters, but if Canada has the physical infrastructure to regulate traffic, monitor vessels, conduct inspections, and provide essential services, the legal argument becomes increasingly irrelevant. De facto control supersedes de jure disputes. And here's the strategic nightmare for Washington. China and Russia are watching very carefully. If the United States succeeds in treating the Northwest Passage as international waters, that establishes a precedent. Chinese vessels can claim the same right of passage. Russian ships, too. Any nation can transit without Canadian authorization. That's catastrophic for North American security. The entire reason NORAD exists is to defend the continent from threats coming over the Arctic. If hostile nations have unrestricted access to Arctic waters adjacent to North America, that defensive perimeter collapses. Some American strategists have started recognizing this challenge. There have been quiet discussions about whether the United States should reconsider its position, whether North American security actually requires supporting Canadian sovereignty over the passage rather than opposing it. But those discussions require Washington to admit it was wrong for 70 years. They require accepting that Canada, not the United States, controls access to a $900 billion trade corridor. They require acknowledging that American pressure on Canada backfired spectacularly. Trump isn't capable of that kind of strategic recalculation. In every month that passes, Canada builds more infrastructure that makes its sovereignty claim more concrete. Here's where it gets really interesting. Canada and the United States are NATO allies. They share continental defense through NORAD. They cooperate on virtually every major security issue. But on the Northwest Passage, they're on opposite sides. NATO hasn't officially taken a position on the dispute. The European Union has historically sided with Canada, recognizing its sovereignty claims. But NATO, as an alliance, defers to American leadership on Arctic security, and Washington has made clear it won't change its position. This creates a bizarre situation where NATO allies are in a sovereignty dispute with each other at the same time that NATO is trying to coordinate Arctic defense against Russia and contain Chinese expansion in the region. Canadian strategic navigation. Canadian officials are navigating this carefully. They're strengthening defense partnerships with Nordic countries, especially Finland and Sweden, who recently joined NATO and bring serious Arctic capabilities. They're conducting joint exercises, sharing intelligence, building interoperability. But they're also making clear that Arctic sovereignty is non-negotiable. When Canada says the Northwest Passage is Canadian internal waters, that applies to everyone, including the United States, including NATO vessels. This is creating tension that didn't exist before. For decades, the sovereignty dispute was theoretical. Canada claimed ownership, America disagreed, but it didn't really matter because the passage wasn't practically useful anyway. Now it matters enormously, and Canada is forcing the issue by building infrastructure that makes its claims enforceable. NATO allies are going to have to decide, do they support Canadian sovereignty or American freedom of navigation? Most European NATO members will likely side with Canada, both because they've supported Canada's legal position historically and because they don't want to set precedents that could undermine their own maritime claims elsewhere. But they're not going to openly defy Washington either. The result is strategic ambiguity that actually works in Canada's favor. As long as NATO doesn't take an official position, Canada can continue building infrastructure and asserting control without triggering a full alliance crisis. Russia has been building Arctic infrastructure for decades. 50 icebreakers, military bases along the entire northern coast, plans to move 100 million tons of cargo annually through the northern sea route by 2030. Moscow sees the Arctic as central to its economic and strategic future. China calls itself a near-Arctic state, despite being nowhere near the Arctic Circle. Beijing has been investing heavily in icebreaker technology, conducting research missions throughout the Arctic Ocean, mapping the seabed, and establishing relationships with Arctic nations. For years, Canada and the United States presented a united front against Russian and Chinese Arctic expansion. They might disagree about the Northwest Passage, but they agreed on keeping Moscow and Beijing from dominating the region. Trump's trade war with Canada damaged that unity. When Carney started diversifying Canadian trade partnerships, that included exploring Arctic cooperation with nations the United States wants Canada to resist. Canada hasn't gone so far as to partner with Russia on Arctic development. That would be too provocative given Ukraine and broader geopolitical tensions. But Chinese investment in Canadian Arctic projects, that's suddenly on the table in ways it never was before. And if the United States keeps insisting the Northwest Passage is international waters, that directly benefits China. Beijing can claim the right to transit Canadian Arctic waters anytime it wants, using the same legal argument Washington makes. Canada can't stop Chinese vessels if it can't stop American ones. This is Trump's strategic blunder in miniature. He thought he could pressure Canada without consequences. Instead, he pushed Canada toward exactly the kind of Arctic independence and international partnerships that undermine American strategic interests in the region. The trajectory forward. The transformation of Canada's Arctic is just beginning, but the trajectory is clear. By the early 2030s, Canada will have functioning deep-water ports, permanent icebreaker presence, expanded military infrastructure, the physical capability to regulate traffic through the Northwest Passage, regardless of what other nations claim about its legal status. The economic advantages are substantial. Canada's critical minerals reach market. Shipping companies pay fees for navigation services. Northern communities gain employment and infrastructure. Canada establishes itself as a major player in Arctic trade rather than just watching Russia and China dominate the region. The strategic implications are enormous. North American security improves because Canada can monitor and control who accesses Arctic waters. NATO gains a more capable northern ally. The precedent that allies can successfully resist American pressure gets established for the world to see. And the United States?
Washington ends up on the outside of a $900 billion trade corridor, unable to dictate terms, watching Canada build infrastructure that makes American legal arguments increasingly irrelevant. Trump's expected Canada to fold. He assumed economic pressure would force Canadian submission on trade, that size meant leverage, that allies had no choice but to accept American demands. Instead, he triggered the largest Canadian Arctic infrastructure investment in history. He provided Canada the motivation to finally substantiate its sovereignty claims with actual physical presence. He demonstrated to the world that American power isn't as absolute as Washington believes. The empty chair at Trump's negotiating table isn't because Canada is weak, it's because Canada is too busy constructing an Arctic future that doesn't depend on American authorization. And every icebreaker Canada launches, every port it upgrades, every military facility it constructs makes that future more real and American influence more irrelevant. The Arctic is opening, the passage is clearing, and Canada just staked its claim in ways that Washington can't ignore and can no longer prevent. Trump thought he was demonstrating American strength. He accidentally showed the world how to resist it.